So we're now going to go to our next speaker, who is Lauren Levey. Lauren Levey is a board member of WDI USA and also serves as coordinator of its Lesbian Caucus and coordinator of its state legislative advocacy team. Lauren also serves as coordinator of Lesbian Bill of Rights International, LBORI, and she's going to talk to us today about a meeting with Reem Alsalem on forms of sex-based violence against women and girls. So thank you so much, Lauren, for coming on and for doing all the work that you do promoting the sex-based rights of women and girls, and for telling us about this important intervention. Okay, over to you, Lauren.
I was here on FQT 3 weeks ago talking about the statements that were submitted by the WDI USA Lesbian Caucus and by Lesbian Bill of Rights International, or LBORI, to the United Nations CEDAW committee. The topic of both statements was the harms of gender stereotypes and how to combat them. I think that it was specifically because of the CEDAW submission by LBORI that I was invited to a 3-hour online live group consultation with Reem Alsalem, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Girls, which was held March 19th. I was completely surprised by the invitation. I've never done anything like that. And of course, I was delighted to get the chance to speak directly to Reem Alsalem about lesbians. The session was recorded, and so was the chat, but those recordings will not be made public in order to allow the consultants to feel that they could speak freely. So for that reason, I don't feel free to tell you the substance of what any particular individual said. However, I will tell you some of the interesting themes that were raised. The special rapporteur provided 4 subtopics for the consultants to be prepared to discuss, all in relation to the main topic, which was forms of sex-based violence against women and girls, new frontiers, and emerging issues. The 4 subtopics were: first, language; second, sex-based violence and new technologies; third, sexual orientation and sex-based violence; and fourth, recommendations for her report. I didn't prepare to speak on new technologies because I figured correctly, as it turned out, that other people would be much better informed about things like AI, for instance. I did prepare to speak about language and sexual orientation and to make recommendations, all with respect to lesbians. It was interesting to see who showed up for the Zoom call. There were about 40 consultants present. I think all but one was a woman. Overall, they seemed generally critical of transgenderism in varying degrees, although they weren't all radical feminists, but some were. There was at least one proponent of true trans, that is the notion that some people truly were born in the wrong sex body. And there was a small amount of frankly personal criticism of the special rapporteur for her continuing stance against transgenderism. I was happy to see that there were some familiar faces from WDI present, also including Dianne Post, who will be speaking after me. And I'm looking forward to hearing Dianne's report on the consultation. There was also some private networking happening in the chat, at least for me, so that was a bonus. The first hour was spent on language and sexual orientation. Those 2 subtopics were put together. Each remaining topic, that is new technologies, and then the recommendations, each of those was allotted about an hour. Combining language and sexual orientation made sense because, as it turned out, there were only 2 consultants who represented lesbian organizations, and we both got a chance to speak during that first hour. It was generally acknowledged that sexual orientation is currently under-discussed, and that when it is discussed, it's often linked with gender identity, which makes the discussion useless, of course. Furthermore, current discussions of lesbians often omit those lesbians who don't identify as lesbians, but instead identify as men. It was also mentioned that more research needs to be done specifically on lesbians, For instance, domestic violence and lesbian relationships was one topic that was suggested. There was some general agreement that conventional meanings of words like woman and lesbian should be used universally, and that on the one hand, neither woman nor lesbian should include men. And on the other hand, neither the word woman nor the word lesbian should be banned, as was suggested in a list put together recently by the Trump administration of words not to be used by US federal agencies, including woman. But girl is apparently okay. It was a multinational group of consultants, so one important point that was made about language was that many languages don't signify gender in the same ways as English or Romance languages do, for instance, in having differentiated pronouns. And some languages don't have separate words for sex and gender. I know I've seen some bad translations where sex is actually translated into English as gender, which may or may not be intentional, right? Someone suggested that a solution that would translate well would be to say, instead of gender, something like socially constructed sex. Other related suggestions included just stop making English the default language and standardize the translation of certain phrases. Next, technological exploitation of women and girls was discussed, including so-called deep fake pornography and related use of technologies such as AI. This was completely new territory to me and quite interesting. It became clear to me in the course of that part of the consultation that the frequent focus in AI discussions on the issue of the presence or absence of consent is maybe misguided. The important issue is that all pornography is violence, and most of that violence is performed on women and girls, and that the whole notion of consent is completely inadequate in the context of sexual activity, which should be desired, not just consented to, right? I also learned the appalling fact that AI has already learned to be discriminatory and violent toward women, as young as it is. AI already needs to be re-educated. The good news, apparently, is that there's at least one woman who has begun working on this project. The final segment of the consultation was devoted to recommendations for the special rapporteur to address governments. Over and over again, consultants pointed out that language is not neutral. It has the power to shape thought. For instance, people like us are now called the anti-transgender movement. This frames us as a hate group, and in some places as enemies of the state. There was broad agreement that women and lesbians need to be fastidious about language, framing our concepts accurately in our own terms and avoiding use of terms created by opposing interests for the purpose of discrediting us. I had raised my virtual hand the moment the final segment on recommendations began, but the end of the 3 hours was approaching rapidly, and it became evident that I would not get the chance to speak a second time. So I put the recommendations I prepared into the chat for Reem Alsalem to review at her leisure and for the other consultants to see in case they were interested. So I'm going to read you what I said on behalf of ELBORI about language and about sexual orientation, followed by the recommendations that I put into the chat. Lesbian Bill of Rights International, or ELBORI, is an international network of radical feminist lesbian organizations that have all adopted the Lesbian Bill of Rights, or the ELBOR. The ELBOR is written in the form of a legislative bill that could be introduced anywhere with minor modifications. It consists of a descriptive list of unjust conditions that lesbians are subjected to, followed by an enumeration of lesbian rights that would, if implemented, address those unjust conditions. We have member organizations in Germany, New Zealand, Australia, Norway, Italy, and the United States. We believe that our radical feminist analysis offers the most realistic and comprehensive tools for understanding and combating the universal structures of male domination and female subordination globally. We encourage you to visit our website, lborinternational.com, where you will find the Lesbian Bill of Rights and articles that we have written. on language. First, the LBOR defines lesbian as a human female homosexual or a woman or girl who is exclusively same-sex attracted. If lesbian is redefined to include any person who claims a lesbian identity, then the word lesbian becomes meaningless, and the demographic of woman-loving women is in effect erased from public discourse. Second, lesbians should be referred to as lesbians, not as LGBTQ+, not as LGB, not as gay. It's best not to use language to force team lesbians with any other demographic, because lesbians are uniquely situated and we need unique protections. Third, the effects of forcibly erasing the actual lesbian demographic in language, whether by enabling anyone at all to claim a lesbian identity, or by forced teaming lesbians with non-lesbian demographics or concepts, lead directly to today's topic number 3, that is sexual orientation and violence. Erasure and forced teaming lead to violence. As to sexual orientation and sex-based violence, first, so-called hate speech laws are being used to prevent sex realists from calling a man a man. Al-Bori has written an article on the topic of so-called hate speech laws that can be found on our website. Second, coercive conversion therapy is back, now coming from psychotherapy proponents of gender identity. Simultaneously, lawmakers are going through the motions of banning conversion therapy, but their bills are forced teaming gender identity with sexual orientation. Since gender identity and sexual orientation are in direct contradiction to each other, such laws are completely useless, except to double bind therapists and other counselors. Al-Bori has written an article on conversion therapy that can be found on our website. Third, there is extensive social shaming of lesbians for having a transphobic genital preference or something like that. And fourth, the shaming of lesbian results at the law and policy level in loss of public lesbian spaces, as in Australia. Here are some consequences of lesbian shaming. The term lesbian has come to include heterosexual men and also to reference a category of pornography that caters to men. These have become the only acceptable uses of the term lesbian in so-called progressive circles. Hostility toward any lesbians who use the word to exclude men is internalized as shame in young or new lesbians. This hostility creates pressure on lesbians not only to identify as anything other than lesbian, but to engage in sexual relations with men or else be labeled an exclusionary Nazi bigot. Lesbian shaming creates unjust obstacles to new lesbians who want to come out as woman-loving women, and it is driven in part by formerly lesbian supportive organizations that are now captured by transgender ideology. In many places, most notably but not exclusively in Australia, lesbians are prohibited by law from gathering publicly as exclusively female homosexuals, either to plan advocacy on their own behalf or to meet socially in single-sex spaces such as lesbian bars or public meeting halls outside the presence of predatory men. As a result of increased erasure, hostility, shame, threats of violence, and outright acts of violence that target lesbians in every country, it is currently trending for new lesbians to carefully avoid the term lesbian to describe themselves and instead use terms such as queer, masc, meaning masculine, or non-binary. Consequently, the numbers of self-acknowledged lesbians are greatly reduced. Official data collection is skewed. There is damaging political division within the lesbian community, and lesbian political influence is further diminished. As a result of all of these factors, there is a scarcity of visible, positive lesbian messaging and role models, and many lesbians are socially and politically isolated with no viable lesbian community, leaving them particularly susceptible to various forms of violence. from random physical attacks on the street to so-called psychological counseling that can range from a diagnosis of pathology to a diagnosis of so-called gender dysphoria, to numbing medications, to conversion therapy so that they will accept male sexual partners, and to harmful medical interventions of wrong sex hormones and surgeries to disguise the female sex characteristics. Because why would anyone want to be a lesbian under such conditions? It understandably seems easier to mutilate your healthy female body with harmful drugs and surgeries that will seriously impact your health and your longevity. While I was speaking, the special rapporteur was listening carefully. She nodded frequently, and when I was finished, she thanked me for my specificity. Okay, here are the recommendations that I put into the chat. Coherent legal definitions consistent with those of the LBOR of sex-based terms, including woman, girl, lesbian, sex, gender, man, and boy. Legal protections for lesbians as a sex and as a sexual orientation, as defined in the LBOR. A human female homosexual or a woman or girl who is exclusively same-sex attracted. Protection of single-sex public spaces where lesbians can lawfully exclude all men and boys. Reference in law and policy to lesbians as a discrete category with political needs and interests that are separate from those of gay men, bisexual individuals, or individuals who claim a gender identity. The recognition that lesbian is a sexual orientation and not a gender identity. Recognition in law and policy that lesbians are first and foremost women and must be included in all legal protections for women, regardless of their nonconformity with gender stereotypes. For example, lesbians should never be excluded from women's public bathrooms, no matter how masculine they may present. Recognition in law and policy that lesbians have a right to protection as lesbians, whether or not lesbianism is believed to be innate and immutable. So far, there is no credible evidence that lesbian has an immutable biological basis. That is, lesbianism is not like race, but requires legal protection anyway. Legal protection from forced conversion therapy and from forced sterilization. The right of minors to be free of indoctrination into gender identity ideology and its resulting disfiguring surgeries and drugs, and the right to grow up lesbian, gay, or bisexual, as most trans-identifying youths most likely would, absent indoctrination. The right to have lesbians' sexual and romantic boundaries protected in law and policy. That is, the right to avoid men and actively seek women. This would include, for instance, the right of online dating sites to exclude men from the lesbian pool. The right to be free from discrimination in employment, housing, physical and mental health care, and public accommodations. The right not to have lesbian relationships and sexuality fetishized in media and in porn. The right to be free from discrimination in adopting children. The right to be free from all sex stereotypes or gender without discrimination. Support for detransitioned women who are lesbians, both within the lesbian community and by the medical and pharmaceutical industries. The right to speak freely in public about the reality of sex without being shut down under so-called hate speech laws. Offensive speech must be protected. In fact, offensive speech is the only speech that needs legal protection. I saved free speech for last because I believe that free speech is necessary to support every other recommendation. So that's it. If you'd like to see my statement written out, you can find it on the LBORI website, which again is lborinternational.com. Thank you.